Well, I guess what bothers me too is that it got past all the engineers and the test pilots and all the other folks at Boeing, except that story that ran a couple of weeks ago, the fellow at the Seattle Times wrote, Dominic Gates. He interviewed engineers that said, look, don't use my name, but I can tell you that I told them that this was a bad idea. And so there are just going to be, I think, a lot of lawsuits against Boeing, and it's going to cost them a lot of money.
Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with news and safety tips for pilots and student pilots. I'm Max Truscott. You just heard Flying Magazine's senior editor, Rob Mark. He and I were interviewed at Sun and Fun about the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, and I'll play that interview later. Plus, we'll be talking today about the many lessons that GA pilots can learn from those crashes. And of course, we'll be talking about my week in Florida at Sun and Fun. And if you're listening to us for the first time, please touch the subscribe button on your smartphone so new shows will download each week for free onto your phone. And if you have thought about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision Jet, or if you'd like flight training in one, there are just so many things that I can help you with if you'll just please give me a call. It's a free consultation, and under some circumstances, I can even set up a free demo flight for you. So please give me a call at 650-967-2500. Now, last week in episode 104, we talked about how best to learn advanced avionics and a process for upgrading the avionics in your aircraft. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. Plus, this week, we have lots of announcements from Sun and Fun and from Aero 2019 in Friedrichshafen, Germany. Plus, we'll have the unusual story of how the relationship between man and dog proved deadly for one pilot. All this and more, and the news starts now. From Flying Magazine at flyingmag.com, Piper announced 2 new value-priced additions to its trainer class of aircraft at the opening day of Sun and Fun. They are the Pilot 100 and Pilot 100i trainers. The basic 100 includes the Garmin 3X Touch certified avionics and a standard 2-pilot configuration, while the instrument version, the 100i, comes standard with a Garmin G3X Touch and a GFC autopilot. The VFR-equipped 100 will enter the marketplace at $259,000. The IFR version, the 100, is $285,000. It's also going to include a new power plant, a newly designed 180-horsepower Continental Prime IO-370-D3A engine that includes a new generation of magnetos designed to eliminate hot start problems. The Continental engine gives the new aircraft a 128-knot cruise speed and a 520-mile range with a 45-minute reserve. Piper CEO Simon Caldecott said the new aircraft was identified following extensive research and the rapid expansion of trainer sales. Since 2014, sales of the single-engine Piper Archer have grown more than 93%. Now, just to put this in perspective, if you go back about 9 years, Piper introduced the Sport Cruiser, an LSA aircraft, back in January of 2010, but unfortunately they discontinued it a year later after just 45 aircraft were sold. Now I got to test fly that aircraft, and I really loved it. So this time I think the difference is that the training market is up substantially, whereas around 2010 we were still coming out of a recession. So I'm guessing that Piper will have a more long-term commitment to this new offering. From aeronews.net, Lancair's new 2-seat Barracuda was displayed at Sun and Fun. The latest aircraft innovation from Lancair is the Barracuda, a 2-seat little brother to the groundbreaking Mako. The first Barracuda to be built, November 380 Lima, was on display at Lancair's Sun and Fun exhibit. The Barracuda design was developed from the classic Lancair legacy. The innovative auto-retracting nose gear from the Mako adds 10 to 12 knots to the aircraft's cruise speed by cleaning up the turbulent slipstream behind the propeller. With the standard Lycoming IO-390 4-cylinder engine putting out 210 horsepower, the Barracuda offers highly competitive performance and excellent handling throughout the flight envelope. Cruise speeds of over 200 miles per hour and fuel consumption of 10 to 12 gallons per hour are expected, along with excellent climb rate, range, and useful load. Barracuda pricing starts around $175,000 for a complete kit, including airframe, engine, propeller, and avionics. Lancair's Builder Assist program is included with every sale, and a fully completed flyaway-ready aircraft program is also available for additional cost. From AOPA.org, the new Aspen Max display dazzles with color. Now, owners of the Aspen Avionics Evolution displays have just a couple of weeks left to order their Max upgrades, saving a couple $1,000s in the process that can transform their old units to the latest standards. That discount expires on April 30th. Now, even the owner of serial number 1 of the Evolution display, which goes back more than 10 years, can send in a unit for upgrades, which brings the hardware up to the latest standards. Now, they say the upgrade is 90% hardware. It includes replacing the processors, graphic cards, backup battery, and displays. By the way, the company has produced more than 14,000 Evolution 1000 systems over the years. They say the new graphics card can show 16 million colors compared to only 16 for the original. In flight, the colors are said to be bright and crisp with great contrast, even in bright light. Also, especially when looking at the synthetic vision in turns, movement is depicted smoothly with no ratcheting. I guess that would be the jaggies that we sometimes see, which was common on the original display with slower processors. Customers must place an order before April 30th. Certification on the new technology is expected by July, and those ordering soon can expect an appointment to send in their units in October or later. The upgrade takes about 10 days. The upgrade is currently $2,995, and the full price starting May 1st is $4,995. The upgrade includes a 2-year warranty. Among the new features of the upgrade is audio alerting for terrain, traffic, and altitude, which requires one new wire from the PFD to the audio panel. Otherwise, the switch is plug and play. In addition, in systems with 2 attitude heading reference systems, the owner can ditch all standby instruments because the new versions include dual GPS-aided AHARS, which displays a GPS-derived airspeed in the event of an AHARS failure. The change is enunciated but allows the pilots to safely continue the flight and obviates the need for backup displays or instruments. By the way, if you were to buy a brand new Evolution 1000 Max unit, that's going to cost you $9,995 and should begin delivering in July. From AOPA.org, Bai approaches 300 electric aircraft orders. Now, George Bai, CEO of Bai Aerospace, which is located in Colorado, says that customers have placed orders for nearly 300 of his electric aircraft. The 2-seat E-Flyer 2 launch customer was the Spartan School of Aeronautics, which placed an order for 26 of the 90 kilowatt or roughly 115 horsepower Siemens SP-70D powered airplanes. Bai announced additional orders at Aero Friedrichshafen, 10 E-Flyer 2s from L-Fly and 60 from OSM Aviation Academy, which are both Norwegian companies that specialize in training airline pilots. The E-Flyer 2 will be certified under Part 23 small aircraft rules that stipulate a stall speed of no more than 45 knots, 2 seats and a single engine, and that limit flights to day and night VFR conditions. First deliveries of the $349,000 E-Flyer 2 are anticipated in 2021, and delivery of Bai's E-Flyer 4, which is a 4-seat all-electric design that will be IFR certified, are planned for 2022. From ForeFlight.com, ForeFlight's 11.2 is now available with a brand new passenger companion app. It also has new features like route line in the profile view, airspace hiding by altitude, and 3D view available anywhere. Let's talk about the passenger app. It's a new companion app to ForeFlight Mobile that lets your passengers follow along with the flight, and it answers questions such as, are we there yet? Yes, all parents have heard that. Available on the App Store now, Passenger is free to download and requires no setup. Your travel companions will be able to view the route of flight overlaid on the map, real-time aircraft position, speed, altitude, estimated time of arrival, and more right on the iPhone or iPad. Connectivity between ForeFlight Mobile and Passenger is available for all ForeFlight subscribers. To wirelessly share your route with nearby devices running Passenger, tap into More Passenger in the ForeFlight Mobile app, then tap Enable and Start. Both devices should have Wi-Fi enabled for the connection to work. If you make changes to the route, ForeFlight will automatically transmit them to Passenger. Passengers can pan and zoom around the map without affecting anything in your ForeFlight Mobile app. Passenger supports split view and slide over on iPad so users can multitask while staying up to date with flight information. Be sure to let your friends and family know about Passenger before they join you on your next flight. You can find more details at foreflight.com/passenger. From generalaviationnews.com, the FAA has issued its policy for flying without ADS-B after 2020. According to the article, the FAA has issued a statement of policy, and they say agency officials emphasize that the policy is not an alternative to equipping, nor should aircraft owners expect these waivers to be a frequent occurrence. Quote, these per-operation authorizations are not intended to support routine operations of non-equipped aircraft in airspace covered by the rule, the agency said. The FAA anticipates that operators who routinely fly in airspace covered by the ADS-B rule are taking the necessary steps to equip in order to ensure there is no disruption to their operations. Once the ADS-B mandate goes into effect, aircraft owners seeking to fly in airspace covered by the rule, but whose aircraft are not equipped with ADS-B out, must request authorization to operate in that airspace at least 1 hour prior to the proposed flight. Operating in ADS-B airspace without obtaining such authorization is considered a violation. The authorization process is distinct from receiving clearance from ATC to operate in airspace requiring ADS-B. Quote, the policy is very clear. These per-flight authorizations should absolutely not be viewed as a backup option to ADS-B or justification for not equipping, said Heidi Williams, NBAA Director of Air Traffic Services and Infrastructure. Quote, such authorizations are primarily intended for operators awaiting their scheduled ADS-B installations past the January 1, 2020 deadline and for pilots who infrequently operate in the affected airspaces. From flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer Magazine, Tecnam announced 3 new updated models at Aero 2019 in Germany. The latest P2002JF MK2 is now certified for full IFR and VFR day-night in both the CS23 EASA and FAR Part 23 FAA categories. It's aimed at flight schools training for a commercial license. And the P92 has been updated. This totally new P92 MK2 takes the best from the many models of the Tecnam fleet. From the P2008, they took the carbon fiber fuselage and wider cabin design. From the P92 Eaglet, the wing, and Astore, that's Astore, for the window design shape, and the Sierra MK2 for the engine cowling. The P92 MK2 is available as ULM, USLA, and ready for the new European 600 kilogram category. Options include a standard analog cockpit or Garmin G3 Touch. And then finally, the Tecnam P2002 Sierra MK2 has been developed for the new EU 600 kilogram ULM category, which, by the way, is the microlight category, provided that category has been approved by the local civil aviation authority. And they note that so far it has not been approved by the UK CAA, so that would only be available elsewhere in Europe. And from AOPA.org, flight design goes big with their F2 and F4, which were announced this week at Aero 2019 in Germany. Flight Design, maker of the popular CT line of light sport aircraft, revealed 3 new future designs destined for U.S. certification, all built on the core design of the CT series LSAs, but these have larger cabins. The new airplanes have cabins that are 3.1 inches wider and 2 inches taller than the CT series cabins. Door dimensions have also been increased, making for easier exit and entry. The entry door is set 2.3 inches lower than those in the CT series. The F2 will qualify in Europe under CS23 regulations or the expanded 600 kilogram ultralight rules. The company plans to deliver the first U.S. F2 to a customer at EAA AirVenture. It's available with either a 100 horsepower Rotax 912 IS engine or, for the European market, a 141 horsepower turbocharged Rotax 915 IS engine. With the Rotax 912 IS engine, maximum cruise speed is 132 knots, and maximum range is approximately 750 nautical miles. The anticipated price is $195,000, and deliveries are expected to begin in August 2019. The F2E will be powered by a liquid-cooled 100 horsepower Siemens electric motor. This airplane is currently in flight testing. Performance and price information is not yet available. And the F4 is a 4-seater powered by the 141 horsepower Rotax 915 IS turbocharged engine. It'll be certified under Part 23, and like the F2 models, come with the AmSafe panel-mounted airbags, 3-point inertial reel harnesses, a ballistic parachute recovery system, and Garmin's G3X Touch flight display. Although flights won't begin until next year, a flight design spokesperson said that the F4's cruise speed should run between 155 and 160 knots and that maximum range could reach the 800 nautical mile mark. Price is estimated at approximately $300,000. So those are just a few of the many announcements that came out of Aero Friedrichshafen, and there is a great article that talks about day 3 focused on electrics, and you can find that at bydanjohnson.com, and I'll include a link to it in our show notes. And from Flyer Magazine at flyer.co.uk, the Polish-designed single-engine personal jet, the Cirrus LAR-1, has made its first flight. The small jet is powered by the Williams FJ33-5A engine, which, by the way, is the same engine on the Cirrus Vision jet. And the Polaris LAR-1 is produced by a company called Metal Master, co-financed by the European Union, and it's designed for a holder of a private pilot's license. Metal Master says the aircraft can take off and land on short grass airports and has a ground roll of 250 meters. It has a cruise speed of 390 knots and a max speed of 416 knots true airspeed. Service ceiling is 46,000 feet. Maximum weight is 1,500 kilograms, empty weight 700 kilograms, and a range of 1,200 nautical miles. It has 6 seats, the Garmin G600 flight deck, and the wings are detachable, so it's easier to store the aircraft. From GeneralAviationNews.com, GAA advocates raise objection to a proposed drug study among pilots. GAA advocacy groups have raised objections to a proposed FAA study aimed at assessing drug use among pilots by anonymously collecting and testing their urine during physical exams. In an April 3rd letter to the FAA, the groups expressed their strong opposition to the study, noting that the study is, quote, fundamentally flawed and will not accomplish its stated goals. The letter also states that the study does not comply with applicable legal requirements, as well as represents a waste of valuable time, money, and limited resources. Furthermore, it will further erode trust between the pilot community and the Office of Aerospace Medicine. The FAA study comes in response to an NTSB safety recommendation that the agency assess the use of drugs among flying pilots not involved in accidents and compare the results with pilots who died from aviation accidents, according to officials with AOPA. The letter noted that a pilot who is being examined for his or her first, second, or third class medical often has no intention on that particular day to fly or possibly even that week. Pilots often renew their medical certificate when it best fits their schedules and before their current certificate expires. Medical exams are usually scheduled on days pilots are not flying, when a pilot may be taking cold, allergy, or other medications they would not use when flying an aircraft. Test results of a pilot who has no intention of flying on the day of the exam will be erroneously reported as those of an actively flying pilot, resulting in flawed and inaccurate conclusions, according to the letter. AOPA noted they are hopeful that the FAA will abandon the study and refocus its resources on outreach, communication, and education. From the independent.co.uk, a plane lands on a U.S. highway near Nashville, Tennessee, and keeps driving on a busy road. A light aircraft landed on a U.S. highway, but rather than taxi to a stop, it just kept on going. And I took a look at the photograph. This looks to be a 4-lane U.S. highway, and it's not a divided highway with a median strip between the 4 lanes. The incident was filmed by one surprised motorist whose footage shows a small yellow plane taxiing on Highway 43 near Nashville, Tennessee. The pilot was flying to get to Lawrence County High School in Lawrenceburg to attend a demonstration. However, he landed north of town on Highway 43, then taxied the aircraft to get to the school. The Lawrenceburg Police Department said that no charges have been filed. Now, frankly, I'm kind of wondering more about what the FAA thinks about this and whether they're going to talk to the pilot about that. Landing on a road, probably not unusual if you're in Montana or Alaska, but near a major city in the lower 48, pretty unusual. And finally, from KCRG.com, the story of an unusual probable cause that involved a dog. This comes from KCRG.com. The NTSB released the report on a crash that killed a 90-year-old Iowa pilot, and they said that a dog's, quote, likely contact with the flight controls led to the fatal plane crash near Monticello in 2017. The NTSB released its full report on the crash that killed 90-year-old Jerry Naylor in late June of 2017. Naylor's flight-designed CTSW light sport aircraft went down in a cornfield near the Monticello airport. The pilot's dog, a 70 to 75-pound animal, was inside the aircraft and survived. The NTSB report suggested the dog likely caused the pilot to lose control of the plane as it landed. Quote, given the ground track and engine data, the report said, it is likely that the dog contacted the aileron and or stabilator controls during landing, which resulted in the pilot's loss of airplane control and a subsequent aerodynamic stall at a low altitude when the airplane exceeded its critical angle of attack. The report noted that Naylor frequently flew with his dog, and it had outfitted the aircraft with a homemade removable plywood device to prevent the right seat passenger, or in this case his dog, from inadvertently contacting the rudder pedals during flight. Quote, although the device was not approved to be installed in the airplane, the report said there was no evidence that it interfered with the full movement of either control stick or the pilot's side rudder pedals. Federal authorities believed Naylor's plane was in working order at the time of the crash. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then we'll be on to our main topic about lessons that pilots can learn from the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Welcome back. Here's some updates. I want to make a quick note here that Dick Cole, who was the last surviving crew member of the Doolittle raid, passed away last week. He, of course, flew that famous bombing raid on Japan that occurred in the aftermath of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor 77 years ago. He was 103 years old. Over the weekend, I received a press release from the South Dakota Air and Space Museum, which will be commemorating that raid and South Dakota's contribution to it by flying a World War II B-25 bomber, and they'll be visiting key airports in South Dakota on April 16th and 17th, beginning in Sioux Falls late afternoon on April 16th, and then on April 17th in the towns of Mitchell, Pierre, and Rapid City, after which it will go to the Ellsworth Air Force Base as part of that base's April 18th celebration of the raid. Now, the public is welcome to see the bomber at all those stops except for Ellsworth Air Force Base. So if you're in South Dakota, you might want to see this bomber, which actually flew 130 missions in World War II. And you may have seen a video over the weekend of the Strato launch. That's the world's largest airplane, which, of course, was built to launch rockets. And there's a video showing it taking its first flight. So it's got the longest wingspan of any aircraft. So that's kind of an interesting video, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes. Also, a quick shout out to two companies that have reached milestones. So Embraer Executive Jets announced that they have delivered their 500th Phenom 300 corporate jet. And a local client of mine here is buying one, so I'm hoping that we'll get checked out in that later in the year sometime, so that should be fun. And Pipistrel, which has delivered over 1,000 aircraft now. In fact, I test flew the Cirrus when I was in Sun and Fun a week ago. And let me talk about that briefly. First, thanks to my friend from Airplane Geeks podcast, Launchpad Marzari, who set up that demo flight. So pretty fun airplane. It's got a 27-to-1 glide ratio, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. If you look at a typical Cessna 172, I think it's about a 7-to-1 glide ratio. The reason it's got such an amazing glide ratio is it's got 50-foot wings, and it's a motor glider. So you can take off, shut the engine down, and glide. In fact, I was looking at the nearest airport, which was Lakeland Airport, and it was probably 7-8 miles away. It was practically on the horizon. My demo pilot said, yep, no problem. We could glide to there from here. Now, the outer 5 foot of each wing comes off. They're 50-foot wings. That way it'll fit into a standard 40-foot T-hanger. It's got a Galaxy GRS parachute in it, so just like the Cirrus and the CTLS and some of those other aircraft. Now, the wing loading on it is about 10 pounds per square foot. That's pretty typical for a light sport aircraft. And what that really means is you feel the turbulence just a little bit more than you would in something like a 172 or 182, which has a higher wing loading. Anyway, you might want to check out the aircraft if you're thinking of buying a motor glider. One of the nice things about being a motor glider is that you do not need a medical to fly one, yet you could still fly across the entire country. So that's the Pipistrel Cirrus. Now, also, when I was at Sun and Fun, I stopped into the booth for SAFE. That's the Society of Aviation and Flight Educators. I'm a SAFE member, and that's the professional society for CFIs. I've been a member just about since the founding of that organization, which probably goes back roughly 10 years ago. And they put out a press release, which is all about their CFI Proficiency Program Initiative. And they expect that this will help reduce the fatal accident rate for loss of control accidents. Now, this is going to be a 2-day ground and flight course for CFIs to improve their aircraft control skills. They say the program is designed to reduce the number of GA loss of control accidents, which still account for the majority of fatal GA crashes. The first SAFE CFI proficiency session will be held on October 2nd and 3rd at Frederick, Maryland. Of course, that's the home of AOPA. And then they're going to schedule it to be in other cities throughout 2019 and 2020 around the country. So you might want to check that out if you're able to be there. And I should also mention that, of course, SAFE is always looking for new members, and you can join for $45 a year. One of the huge benefits, which I mentioned before, is that you can get a discount on many different aviation products, one of which is ForeFlight. You'll get a 33% discount on your ForeFlight, which, depending upon the level of ForeFlight you buy, may totally pay for itself. So go on out to safepilots.org. I'll have a link in the show notes, which will take you directly to their page where you can join online for $45. By the way, you don't have to be a CFI to join. That's at safepilots.org. And while I was at Sun and Fun, I ran into a number of listeners. I'll just mention a few of them. I talked with Victor Miller, who's out of Jacksonville. He flies a 172 and works in IT, and Glenn Neeson, who is one of our Patreon supporters. Also talked with Paul Turashek. And let's see, ran into Jolie Lucas, who we've had on the show here before. She, of course, is a Mooney ambassador. And I met for the first time Ramona Cox, who goes by Sky Chick on various kinds of social media, Twitter and Instagram and so on. She was in the Honda Generator booth helping people take selfies in the photo booth that they had, so it was fun to meet her. She's got a sweepstakes that she's got coming up, which we'll announce when she's got the details of that available. Let's see who else. I met up with Brian Gibson, who's a listener thinking of buying a Cirrus. And when I was in the Cirrus booth, I ran into some friends of mine there. One of whom was Keith Severinson. Now, Keith manages the Cirrus Flying Club for Cirrus employees. I was impressed to find out that Cirrus, which has, I think, around 1,400 employees, has 8 airplanes in their club. They've got about 250 members, and those planes fly 3,000 hours per year. I mean, you can do the math on that, but that's over 300 hours per airplane, which is pretty amazing. And here's the thing that's really surprising. The rental rate for employees is $50 an hour on the SR20s and $75 an hour for the SR22. So if you're thinking about maybe working for Cirrus someday, there's a nice fringe benefit. And I attended the town hall meeting, which AOPA held, and they had, of course, President Mark Baker speaking. Jennifer Storm, who's vice president of the AOPA Foundation, spoke, as well as some other folks as well, Richard McSpadden. And one thing they talked about was the You Can Fly campaign they have. They're trying to raise $2 million by August 2019, and that's going to be matched by the Ray Foundation. So if you think you might like to support AOPA, between now and August would be a really good time to make a donation to the AOPA Foundation. And I should mention that years ago, they used to make a significant amount of money from the advertising in the magazine. And of course, as you know, over the past 10 years, a lot of magazine advertising has moved to online, Google AdWords and things like that. So AOPA is an outstanding organization, and this is one of the ways that you can now help support them with their mission. By the way, they also talked about local flying clubs, and they said that they have a number of resources that are available, including how to download and create a safety program for your flying club. They also have AOPA ambassadors who can give you advice on how to improve your local flying club. So if you're involved in a club and you want some help from AOPA, give them a call. And during that town hall meeting, they also mentioned that they have a list of MDs, doctors, who are willing to do basic medicals. They said that about a quarter of all pilots are now flying under basic med, though sometimes pilots have trouble finding a doctor who's willing to do that. So if you're in that situation, contact AOPA, and they can share with you the list of doctors who are willing to do basic medicals. And of course, I may have mentioned I spent a lot of time hanging out at Sun and Fun Radio, and I was interviewed a couple of times there, and it was quite enjoyable. So if you get a chance to go to Sun and Fun, I think you'll find that it's a little bit more compact than AirVenture, which is a very, very large show, and yet has many of the same kinds of things available for you there. So that was Sun and Fun. And now before we get on to our main topic, let me briefly mention our Patreon site. If you enjoy this show and you find value in it, well, we can offer you a few goodies if you'd like to choose to support the show. For example, those who support the show at the $4 a month level get scripts for every news show. You can see all the details that I have read in the show here. And at $8 a month, supporters get the scripts plus a list of links to all the stories that we didn't cover in the news because of time constraints. So, for example, this week we had a dozen stories that didn't make it into the news. And, of course, we also have our super supporters who donate $20 a month or more. And I'd like to thank these new Patreon sponsors who have joined us in the last week or two, and they include Randy Bledsoe, Andrew Sinclair, who edited his pledge up to $8 a month, William Birch, Alex Machad, Hans Cathcart, Brian Deere, and Luz Shable. So I'd like to thank them very much for their contributions, and I'd like to thank everyone who helps support the show in any way. So, for example, if You go out to iTunes, you can leave a review for the show, or send us feedback or send us a listener question. Those are all great ways to support the show. In a moment, we'll get to our main topic, 8 lessons that pilots can learn from the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Okay, let's talk about the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, and then we'll talk about lessons that all pilots can learn from these. The first crash was in October of 2018. That was Lion Air Flight 610, which crashed minutes after taking off from Indonesia, killing 189 people. And then on March 10th of this year, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, involving the same 737 MAX jet model, crashed minutes after takeoff, killing all 157 people on board. In both cases, it appears that a system called the MCAS may have been responsible. Now, there was an article posted earlier this month at embeddedartistry.com written by a software engineer, Philip Johnston, called What Can Software Organizations Learn from the Boeing 737 MAX Saga? I'm going to read briefly from that article. Johnson writes, Boeing sold the 737 MAX as an upgrade to the 737 design using larger engines for improved fuel efficiency, up to 14% improvement. Boeing claimed that the 737 MAX operated and flew in the same way as the 737NG, so pilots licensed to fly the 73NG did not need additional training and simulator time for the 737 MAX. Because Boeing increased the engine size to improve fuel efficiency, the engines needed to be positioned higher up on the plane's wings and slightly forward of the old position. Higher nose landing gear was also added to provide the same ground clearance as the 737NG. Now, the larger engines and new positions destabilized the aircraft, but not under all conditions. The engine housings were designed so that they did not generate lift in normal flight. However, if the aircraft is in a steep pitch, such as when you're in takeoff or in a really steep turn, the engine housings generate more lift than on previous 737 models. Depending upon the angle, the airplane's inertia can cause the plane to overswing into a stall. To address the increased stall risk, Boeing developed a software solution, the MCAS, which stands for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. Now, no other plane uses a system like the MCAS. The Boeing has a similar system on its KC-46 Pegasus military aircraft. The MCAS is part of the flight management computer system, and the pilot and co-pilot each have their own flight computer, but only one has control at a time. The MCAS takes readings from the angle of attack, or AOA sensor, to determine how the plane's nose is positioned relative to the oncoming air. The MCAS monitors airspeed, altitude, and angle of attack. When the MCAS determines that the AOA is too great, it automatically performs 2 functions to prevent a stall. 1, it commands the aircraft's trim system to adjust the rear stabilizer and lower the nose. And 2, it pushes the pilot's yoke in the down direction. Now, the movement of the rear stabilizer varies with the speed of the plane. The stabilizer moves more at slower speeds and less at higher speeds. By default, MCAS is active when AOA is high, such as you're in a ascent or a steep turn, autopilot is off, and the flaps are up. The MCAS will deactivate once any of the following is true. The AOA measurement is below the target threshold, the pilot overrides the system with a manual trim setting, or the pilot engages the cutout switch, which disables automatic control of stabilizer trim. If the pilot overrides the MCAS with trim controls, it will activate again within 5 seconds after the trim switches are released if the sensors still detect an AOA over the threshold. The only way to completely disable the system is to use the cutout switch and use the manual trim control. Now, when I was at Sun and Fun last week, I was interviewed on Sun and Fun Radio along with my co-host on the Airplane Geeks podcast, and I'm going to play a portion of that interview where we talked about the MCAS system. I'll play that now, and afterwards we'll talk about what any pilot can learn from the 737 MAX crashes. On the recording, you'll be hearing co-host Max Flight, former co-host Rob Mark, and contributor Launchpad Marzari, and me. Here's that recording.
I know, Rob, you've been on some of the networks, the major news outlets talking about this topic. What do you think the big issues are that we should all be concerned about?
Well, I'll tell you one issue that bugs the heck out of me about this is, of course, as you said, the investigations are still going on, so it's all speculation. We're looking at similarities between the two accidents and the profiles of, how the airplanes went down. But in both cases, I've heard bad, about this bad signal coming from the angle of attack indicator. And they're talking about a software update for the Boeing to fix. And nobody has said, by the way, why do these angle of attack indicators keep giving the Boeing MCAS system bum information? I haven't heard anybody talk about that, and I'm still waiting for that. I just think that's very strange.
Yes. I've thought the same thing, and I started to poke around. There are a couple of manufacturers of these angle of attack indicators, at least as used by the airframers, the major airframers. And I would think that those folks would be very interested in kind of understanding what's going on here.
And nobody's even mentioned it.
Yeah,
it's in fact just today I saw something that said the Ethiopian guys, from what little they got out of the flight data recorders, I don't know where this information came from, but they said they did try the fix that Boeing was trying to get pilots to use, and I still understanding how it works, that doesn't make any sense to me, because they're essentially pulling the circuit breakers on the electrics, and without that, I don't see how this thing could keep happening. But
my question is that just struck me was that always been taught, and I'll leave it to the two jet guys who've done the most, is that when you hit that autopilot disconnect, the automation should stop helping you fly the airplane. You're on your own now. And that's when the MCAS started originally, and the solution was to turn the autopilot back on. And that's like never been in the checklist of, turn the autopilot back on.
Yeah, I can't imagine if you're having a pitch problem, the last thing I'd want to do is turn the autopilot on, because autopilots have very distinct limits of movement as to when they can capture the airplane, and they're in that kind of a situation with this porpoising. I cannot imagine the autopilot even engaging. But again, these people they're so confused as to what's happening. There's so many, there's so many unanswered questions. We're going to have to wait for the reports, obviously, but I just can't imagine how the second one got away from people. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as you described there, the behavior is totally counterintuitive, and partially because when you engage in autopilot, most of them will maintain your current attitude. So if you're wildly pitching up or wildly pitching down, probably the last thing on a pilot's mind is, oh yeah, let's get some help in maintaining this wild attitude, either up or down. But prior to this, you guys know this is a second career for me. I spent 25 years working at one of the world's largest computer manufacturers, and used to deal with data rooms that were filled with literally multiple millions of dollars worth of computers. And if one of those things goes down, it costs companies hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour. And one of the big things in designing a data room is you're trying to eliminate single points of failure. Right. And certainly you try and do the same thing from an engineering standpoint in critical things like airplanes. And so it's just beyond me that there could have been a design that was approved that had just a single AOA, which became a single point of failure, which would lead to this kind of behavior. Yeah. Now, there may have been an option for perhaps two AOAs, and maybe some airlines didn't buy the option for the second one. But something about this just doesn't pass the smell test. As an engineer, from a design standpoint, there's something really wrong with a design like that being approved.
But I think, go ahead. You were going to say something. Well, I guess what bothers me too is that it got past all the engineers and the test pilots and all the other folks at Boeing, except that story that ran a couple of weeks ago, the fellow at the Seattle Times wrote, Dominic Gates. He interviewed engineers that said, look, don't use my name, but I can tell you that I told them that this was a bad idea. And so there are just going to be, I think, a lot of lawsuits against Boeing, and it's going to cost them a lot of money. And today or yesterday we just heard it's going to take an extra few weeks to get the software approved by the FAA, because the FAA is going to really want to tread very carefully on this.
Sure.
And then you've got to get people to fly the airplane again. I don't mean the pilots. I'm talking about the public. And they may say, well, let's see how this all works out.
And it sounds just vaguely familiar of one of the first shuttle disaster where the engineers said, hey, it's too cold. We could have a problem here. Management overruled them. So in general, I think engineers rock. They know their business. They know where the shortcomings are. And sometimes they get overruled by folks, and it can lead to these kinds of problems.
I was reading, and I can't remember the source, but I think it's a case of they had terms for it of catastrophic versus critical versus,
yes.
And they got the MCAS and its system that supports it in the certification to be rated as a one or two levels down from catastrophic, and therefore that's how it flowed through. And it's like, wait a minute, who decided that it's not a catastrophic versus a critical versus a hazard versus a whatever their scale is?
Yeah, it is really scary, and then of course is Max, when you've been in a simulator, we know when we're in a simulator, they're always going to try to break something on us. The engine's going to quit, the flaps aren't going to work, the gear won't come down, you get ice. We always know they're going to do something, but when it happens in real life, and you're just sitting there fat, dumb, and happy, going, "Yeah, let's take off," and something happens that is a surprise, and part of your brain goes, "Oh, Jesus," and that takes
live radio.
That takes 5 seconds alone for the adrenaline to slow down, and you just say, "What in the world is going on?" And in fact, those poor guys in Ethiopia, I didn't realize that they were only 450 feet in the air when this started, so they didn't have a lot of room for error.
No. Well, I think there's a lot more to learn about what's happened and to learn about what the root causes are, what the contributing factors were in these accidents, and just really what is the change that we need to see. I have the feeling it's more than just a change in some software. I think there's maybe some deeper issues that'll be addressed. But in the meantime, the FAA is I'll say suffering under accusations of being too trusting of the manufacturers. You've got the manufacturer, in this case Boeing, that's suffering under demands from its customers for compensation for all of this, and it's just not a very pleasant thing. You hate to see these things in aviation. But one thing that really concerns me is we're seeing the specter of criminal charges, and I've always felt that one of the advantages of or one of the good features of the aviation system or culture in the United States is that we stay away from that, because that just hinders a good investigation. If there are criminal charges involved, and you may be the target for those. What do? You clam up, and that doesn't help an investigation.
That would just knock me over with a feather if at some point we find out that someone was criminally negligent at the feds or at Boeing or something. I can't believe anybody would knowingly
there's not a level of complicity there.
I don't think this was purposeful. I think this is probably a systemic problem where somehow there were just enough little holes in the Swiss cheese, and they just all lined up perfectly. And they'll go back and they'll probably find a chain of at least 3 or 4 different things.
Yeah, absolutely.
If any one of those 3 or 4 hadn't happened, this wouldn't have slipped through. Right. And it's probably going to change some of the processes at Boeing, I suspect. I think they're going to be certifying aircraft a little bit differently in the future.
What I'm concerned with, looking long, Boeing's going to fix this. We know that. They're going to fix it. Whether it's cheaper or expensive, they're going to fix it. What I'm looking long for is how much of the pendulum swinging where the FAA now wants to see every single thing you're doing and how that's going to affect Gamma.
It's an interesting point.
Suddenly certification of new aircraft is going to just be, an impossible hill to climb, because you just can't afford, especially at some of the lighter end or middle end.
Sure, we just went through this Part 23 rewrite to simplify certification. Look at all the new products. I mean, the avionics sky beacon and the tail beacon. It took them a long time to get it TSO'd, but I mean, nothing compared to what it would have probably taken 10 years ago. And that's a really interesting point that you're making, is that I hope there isn't that now we've got to double, triple, quadruple check everything to get a new product to market, because the prices will go out of sight.
And I don't think that's going to be necessary. I got to say, I think this is probably a fairly narrow set of problems that can be addressed. I don't think it means that we need wholesale overhaul of the certification process. And I think
there are people in Congress that are calling for that.
But
and look at what happened after the Buffalo crash, when they got involved in legislating how many hours a pilot should have before he climbs in the right seat. Except that countries outside of the U.S., Europe, Australia, they don't have the same problem with putting a 500-hour pilot in the right seat, because the hours are kind of irrelevant.
Yeah.
Kind of, not completely.
Which is ironic, because in that crash, the pilots had way over the minimums that are now being mandated.
Exactly.
So in a sense, it was a fix that wasn't directly related to the cause. And I think that's the thing we're hoping doesn't happen here, is that we have new regulations that aren't at all related to the problem that's occurred.
Yeah, well.
But that's the problem with the left brain, right brain. The left brain is very logical and says, data, got to have data, or it doesn't make any sense. And then this right side going, oh my God, this sounds scary, and I don't know if I want to do that. And so that we've got to balance all that somehow.
Yeah, I think that's where we get the emotional knee-jerk reactions. Congress wants to rush for a fix, and that's kind of more on the emotional side than always on the logical side.
Yeah, somehow I thought we had bigger problems to deal with in Washington than we won't. That's right. We can't talk about
politics.
That. Right. Sorry. No politics. I wasn't going to talk politics.
Politics stop at the FAA door.
Yes.
And actually, let me just say, I want to make it real clear. I think the FAA in general does an awesome, outstanding job. So I'm not faulting them in any way, shape, or form. I think they do an amazing job with very limited resources. And I kind of wish that they wouldn't see, declining budgets on the operations side. They've got their arms around a lot of different problems, and they're highly constrained with the budgets and the personnel they have. So anyway, my hat's off to them for what they do.
Yeah.
And my thanks to Sun and Fun Radio for having us on the air, and also to liveatc.net, which archived and gave us copies of the recordings. So let's talk now about the 8 lessons that pilots can learn from the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. I'll go ahead and read through them briefly and then talk in detail about each of them. Number 1, know your aircraft systems intimately. Number 2, the documentation isn't always complete. Join a type club. 2, if you touch something and things get worse, undo what you did. 4, if the autopilot is on and it's doing weird things, turn it off, and vice versa. 5, understand what can cause runaway trim. 6, know how to disable the electric trim system in your aircraft. 7, make sure you can overpower the autopilot. And 8, know the critical single points of failure in your aircraft. Well, let's talk about number 1, know your aircraft systems intimately. I tell my clients that the goal when they're flying is mastery of the aircraft. And you haven't mastered your aircraft if you don't have intimate knowledge of the systems in your plane, because these systems can bite you if they fail and you're unaware of what to do when they fail. Now, some of the Boeing 737 MAX pilots were apparently at a disadvantage, as Boeing may not have documented the system as completely as pilots might like. It appears that some pilots, especially prior to the first crash, may not have known all the details of the MCAS system and may not have known how to disconnect it when it began pitching the aircraft down severely in response to a failure of the AOA, or angle of attack indicator. Now, more information was known 5 months later when the second crash occurred, and although that crash has not been fully investigated, it appears that it too may have been caused by a failed AOA and pilots who didn't know how to disconnect the malfunctioning MCAS system. But regardless, it's in the interest of all pilots to study the systems in their aircraft and become as well-versed to them as possible. A good starting point for that is the POH for the aircraft you fly. While you should read and be familiar with the entire POH, a lot of pilots don't get around to reading Section 7, the systems section, in its entirety. And I can just about guarantee that if you read Section 7, you'll learn something new about your airplane that you didn't know. And you never know which piece of knowledge about your airplane could save your life if a system were to fail. I tell pilots that it makes a lot of sense to learn everything they can about anything that can kill you, especially an airplane. First, it's kind of fun to learn how things work. So if you have a natural curiosity about things, you should want to learn more about the systems in your aircraft. And when you read Section 7, don't just read it once and forget it. Take notes. I don't know about you, but I don't remember everything I read. So I create documents that summarize key facts about the airplanes I fly. In fact, for one of the planes I fly, I recorded some of the training sessions and sometimes listen to them when I'm driving just to refresh my memory of the systems. Now, the way I do that is I have a podcast app called Overcast, which allows me to upload any MP3 file to that app so that I can then listen to my recording using my smartphone whenever I want to listen. So, item number 1, know your aircraft systems intimately. Number 2, the documentation isn't always complete. So even if you read everything in Section 7 of the POH, that may not be the full story. Certainly it appears that the original Boeing documentation for pilots on the 737 MAX 8 and MAX 9 may not have been as complete as it could have been, as Boeing has issued additional system documentation and training material after the first crash, and it's likely that they'll provide more updates to the documentation and training before the aircraft flies again. So the question for you as a pilot is, once you've read Section 7 of the POH, what more can you do? If you're registered with a company that makes your aircraft, you may occasionally receive updates from the aircraft manufacturer when they update a POH. For example, just a few days ago, on April 8th, Cirrus issued an alert service advisory for the SF-50 Vision Jet related to procedures for the handling of any malfunction that might occur on the stick pusher. And to the credit of Cirrus, I received a copy on the same day that they issued it. Now, aircraft type clubs are another great source of information for the aircraft you fly. I once saw a list that had over 100 different type clubs available, so there's probably one specifically for the make or model of the aircraft that you fly. And you don't have to own an aircraft to join a type club. Renters should also strongly consider joining a type club for the aircraft that they fly most often. Now, type clubs vary considerably, but most provide information about systems in your aircraft. They may have a website that posts a lot of information, and some have online forums and magazines. So I strongly urge all pilots to find a type club for the plane you fly and join that club and start learning the details of your aircraft. So number 2, the documentation isn't always complete. Join a type club. Number 3, if you touch something and things get worse, undo what you just did. I'm not sure that this particular rule would have prevented either of 737 MAX crashes, but it's a good starting point for whenever you have a problem in your aircraft. For example, years ago I was flying on downwind with a student pilot when, instead of pulling back the throttle to land, she pulled out the mixture. And yeah, the engine quit. But it didn't take me but a second or two to realize what happened, and I quickly put the mixture back in before the engine had fully quit. Now, here's another example. Imagine if you had a split flap failure, and when you lowered the flaps, only one flap came down. In that case, the aircraft would start to roll rapidly toward the flap that remained up. As the aircraft started to roll, you'll want to quickly deselect the flaps, which should raise the one flap and return the aircraft to a stable condition. Now, by the way, you may have heard that you shouldn't lower the flaps while on a turn, but only when you're on a straight leg, such as on downwind, base, or final. That's because if you did have a split flap, it would probably take you longer to recognize the problem if you lower the flaps in a turn. Also, if you're in a turn and a split flap causes you to bank even more steeply, you may find yourself in an unusual attitude even more quickly than if the problem occurred when the wings were level. So number 3, if you touch something and things get worse, undo what you did. Number 4, if the autopilot is on and it's doing weird things, turn it off, and vice versa. So if you're hand flying and you're having trouble flying, then turn on the autopilot. In the case of the Boeing 737 MAX, the behavior was confusing to pilots because the MCAS only works when the autopilot is off. And normally when an autopilot is off, airplanes can't make uncommanded changes to the controls, as only the pilot controls the plane when the autopilot is off. But in the 737 MAX, the MCAS only works when the autopilot is off. So seeing the plane start thrashing around with the autopilot off would initially be very confusing to any pilot. But oddly, if the pilots had followed our rule number 4 and turned the autopilot on because things were going badly while they were hand flying, the MCAS would have been disconnected by the autopilot and the problem would have gone away. Now, first let me say that autopilots are wonderful things, and if you don't have one in your plane, you should consider adding one. They're wonderful because they take over a low-level task from a pilot, which can be very fatiguing over time. And I think it's silly to wear yourself out hand flying on a long trip if an autopilot can do that work for you. That way you can have more time to think about higher-level tasks, such as monitoring the weather and considering various alternatives as the flight unfolds. And if the autopilot does something totally unexpected, the fastest way to resolve the issue is to disconnect the autopilot and hand fly. And likewise, if you're hand flying and you fear that you may be overwhelmed and are losing control, then you should turn on the autopilot to help you. So, number 4, if the autopilot is on and it's doing weird things, turn it off, and vice versa. Number 5, understand what causes runaway trim. What the MCAS system apparently did in the 2 Boeing 737 MAX crashes is somewhat analogous to what happens in a runaway trim situation, though in the case of the 737 MAX, it was less obvious what was going on when the MCAS takes over, because as we mentioned in the Sun and Fun radio interview, things like runaway trim usually only happen when the autopilot is on, whereas in the 737 MAX, the MCAS only works when the autopilot is off. Let's talk about runaway trim, what it is, and how you might encounter it in a GA aircraft such as a 172 built after 1997, because all of those included autopilots, and because runaway trim is most likely to occur when you have electric trim and an autopilot in your aircraft. The first thing to know is that the autopilot controls pitch by moving the trim wheel. Usually these changes are relatively slow, so you might not even notice the trim wheel moving. And when the autopilot is on, you want to be careful to make sure that you're not pushing or pulling on the yoke, and make sure that you're not accidentally leaning on the yoke. Because if the autopilot is on and you either intentionally or even unintentionally push or pull on the yoke, the autopilot will counteract your pushing or pulling by running the trim wheel in the opposite direction. And here's the important thing. It'll run that trim wheel continuously as long as you're pushing or pulling on the yoke. So, relatively quickly, it will run the trim wheel to the full extreme where it hits a stop and can't go any further. That condition is runaway trim. Then, if the autopilot disconnects, which it may do when it hits the stop, you're going to have an extremely out-of-trim aircraft that will either pitch up hard into a stall or point down toward the ground. And to overpower this out-of-trim condition, it may take all the strength you have in your arms to either push forward to prevent a stall or to pull back to prevent the aircraft from crashing into the ground. The latter, of course, is what was happening with the MCAS system. It was pointing the aircraft nose down so much that the pilots may not have been strong enough to keep the nose up. So number 5, understand what causes runaway trim. Number 6, know how to disable the electric trim system in your aircraft. If the autopilot or the electric trim system is trying to kill you, as the MCAS system was in the 737 MAX accidents, it's critical that pilots have the knowledge to disable that system. So in other words, you have to know how to shoot the trim system or the autopilot before it kills you. And that's apparently what the pilots in the 737 MAX accidents were unable to do. In some GA aircraft, the electric trim system is on the same circuit breaker as the autopilot. So if you pull that circuit breaker, you disable both systems, and then you should be able to hand fly the airplane without any interference from the electric trim or autopilot. Note that if the autopilot is trying to kill you, there are usually 3 or more ways to disable it. One is to push the autopilot disconnect switch, which is usually located on the yoke. Another is to turn off the autopilot. And a third way is to pull the autopilot circuit breaker. So number 6, know how to disable the electric trim system in your aircraft. Number 7, make sure you can overpower the autopilot. If you're unfamiliar with the full pre-flight of your autopilot, you should look it up. You can find the autopilot pre-flight information in Section 9. That's the supplement section of your POH, or perhaps it's in a separate user manual that came from the autopilot manufacturer. Often, part of the pre-flight procedure is to ensure that you can overpower the autopilot. To do that, you turn on the autopilot and then try to move the yoke. If you can't move the yoke, then the autopilot is stronger than you, and you probably want to have an avionics technician verify that it's operating properly, as you should always be able to overpower the autopilot. If you can move the controls with the autopilot on, then you're able to overpower the autopilot. And that is important because if you end up in a life and death struggle with your autopilot, you want to know ahead of time that you're going to win that battle. And as I mentioned before, normally if the autopilot is on, you should keep your hands off the controls, as you don't want to create a runaway trim condition. Either you fly the plane or the autopilot flies the plane, but you should never try to fly the plane while the autopilot is still on. But if the autopilot malfunctions and tries to kill you, then you should overpower the controls to maintain control of the airplane and then disconnect the autopilot as quickly as possible. So number 7, make sure you can overpower the autopilot. And number 8, Know the critical single points of failure in your aircraft. In the case of the Boeing 737 MAX, which had a single angle of attack indicator, that turned out to be a critical single point of failure. Now, I think there was an option for a second AOA, but apparently not all aircraft had that. Now, if the AOA fails or is knocked off because of a bird strike, the MCAS in the 737 could think the aircraft was being pitched up in a stall and trim the aircraft down with catastrophic results. If you're flying IFR in an aircraft with a single vacuum pump that drives your attitude indicator and heading indicator, like in a Cessna 172 or a 182, that vacuum pump is a single point of failure. Now, years ago, I called a major manufacturer of vacuum pumps, and the technician I reached said that the pumps typically fail every 500 to 1,000 hours. And as a vacuum pump fails, the gyros slowly start to spin down, and the attitude indicator will slowly show a tilt to the left or the right, which is going to get worse and worse. And if you're flying the airplane to follow that tilt, you can eventually end up in an unusual attitude unless you're constantly cross-checking your gyro instruments. Of course, if you notice a discrepancy between the gyros, you'll then need to figure out quickly which gyros are correct and which ones are wrong. And you've got to do that in a pretty short time before you end up in an unusual attitude. A good solution in this case would be to install a second vacuum pump so that if one fails, the second one will continue to power your gyro instruments. Now here's another example. If you're in a glass cockpit aircraft, you'd ideally like to be in a plane with two alternators so that if one fails, you can continue your flight without having to rely on just the standby battery, which might last as little as 45 minutes to get you out of the clouds and into VFR conditions. By contrast, if you have a second alternator, you have very little to worry about if one alternator fails, and you can continue on to your destination. So number 8, know the critical single points of failure in your aircraft. Well, so there you have it. 8 lessons pilots can learn from the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. 1, know your aircraft systems. 2, the documentation isn't always complete. 3, if you touch something and things get worse, undo what you did. 4, if the autopilot is on and is doing weird things, turn it off and vice versa. 5, understand what can cause runaway trim. 6, know how to disable the electric trim in your aircraft. 7, make sure you can overpower the autopilot. And 8, know the critical single points of failure in your aircraft. In a moment, we'll be back with listener feedback and listener questions right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And here's an email from Art, who's one of our Patreon supporters. He says, Max, I'm curious. After many years away from flying, I took a refresher course to get comfortable flying tail draggers from a local school that I found to be outstanding. All instruction is on a super decathlon, and all of the instructors are upset attitude training instructors qualified to instruct in that capacity for a local university's aviation program curriculum. In training, one of the things they constantly preach is the following, quote, in uncoordinated flight, never ever point the rudder at the ground unless you want to do a hammerhead or an accelerated spin entry, unquote. They also teach that when maneuvering to land, if you need to slip, always use the rudder opposite the direction of the turn in the pattern. In other words, use the rudder closest to the sky, not the ground. Thus, if you are turning to the left in a left traffic pattern, always use the right rudder for slips. If you're turning to the right in right traffic pattern, always use the left rudder for the slip. They also teach to never slip with power on. One of the main reasons they teach this is to ensure that you don't snap into an accelerated spin close to the ground as a result of entering into a skidding turn as opposed to a slipping turn close to the ground. Skidding turns is what mostly causes pilots to kill themselves when they overshoot the center line and then apply rudder closest to the ground and in the direction of the turn in an attempt to get the nose to come around to get on center line. It was amazing to me how quickly and violently the airplane turned on its back when entering a stall from a skidding configuration, and how gently and predictably and frankly hard it was to get into a stall if I entered into a spin from a slipping configuration. He says, to be clear, it's not that they are teaching that you should be uncoordinated and not stabilized for the approach. Not at all. They are just trying to show you that there is a difference between how the airplane behaves in a skid versus a slip, and you definitely never want to get it into a skidding situation unless you purposely do it for aerobatics. I only bring this up because in the podcast, you and your guest only discuss the fact that close to the ground, you need to keep the ball centered. However, sometimes it's completely appropriate for pilots to use a slip to bleed off altitude, particularly if they don't have flaps, and thus uncoordinated flight is sometimes appropriate and necessary, even close to the ground. Thus, I think it is important to differentiate between the types of uncoordinated configurations, as one is much more dangerous than the other. Curious as to your thoughts about what I learned and was taught. Well, Art, this is perfect timing. Thanks so much for your email. When I was at Sun and Fun, I sat in on a presentation by Catherine Cavanaro. And by the way, we had her in episode 79. She's an AOPA contributor. She teaches in Tennessee as a CFI. And in her presentation at Sun and Fun, she played a video, and I'll include a link to it here in the show notes, and it shows exactly what you described. She has the aircraft at first in a slipping turn, which has a somewhat graceful entry into a stall, and then she has it in a skidding turn where the low wing drops very dramatically, and you can see that the aircraft would be inverted within a matter of a couple of seconds if the stall recovery was not executed properly. Now, she has an article, again, is timely, in the April issue of AOPA Pilot Magazine. And I'll go ahead and include a link to that here in our show notes. And that article is called Technique, Taming the Stall, Slipped, Skids, and Centering the Ball. And I'll just go ahead and read from this. By the way, just to clarify for folks, a skidding turn is when you might be, for example, in a right turn and you put in too much right rudder. A slipping turn would be if you were in a right turn and you had too much left rudder. So she writes, during a skidding turn, which would be too much right rudder in a right turn, the lowered wing has a high angle of attack. It stalls first, and the result is an under-the-bottom spin entry. Your body can detect this lack of coordination as well, since in a skid, it's pushed to the outside of the turn. The same is true in a car. Make a left turn on an unbanked road and your body, just like the inclinometer ball in a skid, slides toward the right. What feels natural in a car, though, should never feel so in an airplane. While a slip is a valuable flight maneuver, there is no virtue in a skid. Still, accident reports show that pilots skid with disappointing regularity. The classic scenario is the traffic pattern base to final turn, in which, possibly exacerbated by a tailwind on base, the aircraft is about to overshoot the extended runway centerline. Using excessive inside rudder to swing the nose of the aircraft toward the runway results in a dangerous skid in which the low wing stalls first. A skidding stall means the airplane is quickly inverted. At 400 feet above the ground, all the aerobatic prowess in the world won't help, as anyone needs at least several hundred feet for recovery. So, Art, thanks so much for bringing this to our attention, and I would encourage everybody to check out the video, which I've posted on our Patreon site. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you'll find Catherine's video posted there. And here's an email from David in Northern California. He says, I have a question that has perplexed me for some time regarding the approach categories you discussed on episode 100. I was taught to begin approaches at 100 knots and to use the Category B minimums. That said, I slow down and put in flaps to get into landing configuration to be stabilized by 1,000 feet such that I'm flying at Category A speeds inside the final approach fix. Shouldn't the minimums apply to the speed I'd be flying at the MDA rather than at the IAF? I have never seen a clear explanation of which speed applies, given that speed varies and slows approaching touchdown. Hoping you can clarify. Well, David, you say I slow down and put in flaps to be stabilized by 1,000 feet. And most final approach fixes are going to be higher than 1,000 feet AGL. So this suggests to me that you're changing the aircraft configuration and the speed after the final approach fix as you are perhaps descending maybe on the ILS glide slope. When I fly, I prefer to have my airplane fully configured before the final approach fix and to be at my approach speed prior to the final approach fix. Then as I intercept the glide slope, I just lower the landing gear or reduce power, and that way I maintain that same speed that I had prior to the final approach fix all the way down the glide slope to minimums. By contrast, if you're changing configurations as you're descending inside the final approach fix, you're destabilizing your approach somewhat, and you're making more work for yourself. Also, if you're slowing your aircraft in the descent, the aircraft drag is changing, and you're going to need to retrim the aircraft. So I would strongly encourage everyone to get all of that work done before the final approach fix so that you have a constant speed and configuration from the final approach fix to the missed approach point. Now, in your question, you were asking about the IAF. I would be less concerned about speed at the IAF than I would be at the FAF, the final approach fix. Here's what the Instrument Flying Handbook says in Chapter 1. This is the 2012 edition from the FAA. Under landing minimums, it says, the minimum section sets forth the lowest altitude and visibility requirements for the approach, whether precision or non-precision. And it says the minimums ensure that final approach obstacle clearance is provided from the start of the final segment, which would be at the FAF, to the runway or missed approach point, whichever occurs last. So basically it's saying minimums apply from the final approach fix to the missed approach point. And they say minimums are specified for various aircraft approach categories based upon a value 1.3 times the stall speed of the aircraft and the landing configuration at maximum gross weight. If it is necessary to maneuver at speeds in excess of the upper limit of a speed range for a category, the minimums for the next category should be used. So my interpretation of this would be if you're going to fly in category A, then you need to be below 91 knots when you are at the final approach fix. Now, if you really wanted to find out absolutely 100% for sure, I think you'd need to send a letter to the FAA's Office of Legal Counsel and get them to give an interpretation. Hope that helps. And if, by the way, you or anyone else are interested in buying any model of Cirrus airplane or jet, or if you're interested in flight training, call me today for a free consultation. There are a lot of things I can do to help you with the process, and in some cases, I can arrange a free demo flight as well. And I'm always happy to just talk with you about the ins and outs of buying new versus used. Just call me at 650-967-2500 or go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the webpage. And you can also use that to leave any listener questions or give any feedback. I specialize in Cirrus and work with people around the world. And finally, please take a moment to show your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And maybe they don't know what a podcast is. Well, just send them over to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk. And of course, those apps are free. And please check out our Patreon site and consider becoming a supporter of the show. If you find value in the show, and you must, you've been listening for over an hour, please sign up to donate a few dollars every month via your credit card by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.